There's a particular darkness that fills the air in the dead of night, a silence that seems to breathe, waiting, alive. Most people don't think about this silence, they let it slip past unnoticed. But for Eva, the quiet felt like a physical weight, a pressing force that reminded her of things she'd rather forget. Eva had been on the road for 3 hours now. Her job at the law firm kept her busy enough that midnight drives back to her rural home were often the only time she could find to unwind. Tonight, the stress had been almost unbearable. The divorce case she was handling for her client was brutal, messy. Emotions ran hot, but she was used to it. This was the life she had chosen, the life she'd dedicated years to. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard, 2:13 a.m. The highway stretched on, a narrow ribbon of black that led her deeper into the countryside. The city lights had disappeared an hour ago, and now the road was only illuminated by her headlights, twin beams cutting through the pitch-black night. Only another 40 minutes and she'd be home. The first sign of trouble was small. A flutter at the corner of her vision, something pale and quick. Eva tightened her grip on the wheel, convincing herself it was just fatigue. Shadows play tricks, she thought. You're tired. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror, she thought she saw a pale figure standing along the roadside, watching her car pass. Just a trick of the light, she thought again. She pressed on, but something nagged at her. A discomfort that grew in the pit of her stomach. A chill. In the back of her mind, a voice whispered that something wasn't right. Her pulse quickened as her eyes kept drifting to the mirrors, expecting to see something, anything. Then her radio crackled. Static filled the car, a hissing that cut through the silence like nails on a chalkboard. Eva frowned and reached out to turn the volume down, but the static grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. Then, beneath the noise, she heard something else. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, buried deep in the static, but she could make out the words. Turn back. A shiver ran down her spine. Eva's heart pounded, each beat like a drum echoing in her chest. She hadn't touched the radio, hadn't even remembered it was on. The voice faded, and the car filled with silence once more. She laughed nervously, more out of relief than amusement. Get a grip, Eva, she muttered to herself, shaking her head. But when she looked at the road ahead, she froze. The highway was empty, the same as it had been all night, but now there was something, a figure standing dead center in her lane, illuminated by her headlights. She couldn't see the figure's face, but she could tell it was a man, tall and thin, with dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light around him. Eva slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching against the asphalt as she struggled to avoid him. The car swerved, skidding to a halt just inches from the man. She let out a shaky breath and looked up, expecting him to be there, to say something. But he was gone. Nothing. The road was empty. Eva blinked, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen. Had he jumped out of the way? Was it her imagination? She rolled down her window and peered out, searching the shadows, but there was no trace of him. With a trembling hand, she put the car in gear and eased forward, half expecting the figure to reappear in her path. As she drove, the tension in her shoulders relaxed slightly. She convinced herself it had been nothing more than a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion. But then, as her eyes drifted to the rearview mirror, she saw him again. He was sitting in her back seat. Eva screamed, jerking the wheel to the side as she lost control of the car. It spun, swerving off the road and into a shallow ditch, finally coming to a jarring halt. She gasped for air, clutching the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands as she dared a glance into the mirror again. The back seat was empty. Eva's breaths came in ragged gasps as she tried to steady herself. Her heart was racing, her skin cold with fear. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm down, but her thoughts were racing. Stay calm, Eva, she whispered, gripping the wheel. It's just stress. You're seeing things. She took a deep breath, then another, trying to push down the lingering sense of dread. She couldn't stay here, not in the middle of nowhere with no cell reception and nothing but darkness for miles. She started the car again, feeling a sliver of relief as the engine roared to life. She drove slowly, keeping her eyes glued to the road, refusing to look at the mirrors, the back seat, or the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of her headlights. Then, just as she thought she'd put enough distance between herself and whatever had just happened, she saw it again. The figure, standing by the side of the road, watching her pass. She forced herself to keep driving, to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't real. But as she sped down the highway, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with her, lurking just out of sight, hidden in the darkness. Eva kept driving, her eyes darting between the road and the clock. 20 minutes until she'd be home. 20 minutes until she could close the door, lock it, and bury herself under the covers. She just had to make it that far. Then, the radio crackled again. Eva's heart skipped a beat as the static returned, louder this time, filling the car with a suffocating hiss. She reached for the dial to turn it off, but her hand froze when she heard the voice again. Turn back. The words were clearer this time, louder, as if the speaker were right beside her. She yanked her hand away, her pulse racing as the voice continued. Turn back, while you still can. The voice faded, leaving only static. Eva clenched her teeth, gripping the wheel as her knuckles turned white. She didn't know what was happening, didn't want to know. She just wanted to get home, to escape this nightmare. But the voice hadn't lied. There was something waiting for her, something just ahead. As she rounded a bend in the road, she saw it, a car, abandoned and overturned in the ditch. In the dead of night, the world falls silent, a sinister pause in the steady heartbeat of life. A thick fog drapes over the earth like a shroud, muffling even the smallest sounds. The town of Hollow Ridge lay in that quiet, nestled in the folds of endless forest, its houses and streets blanketed by the hush of midnight. Only the whisper of the wind moving through the trees filled the empty spaces, carrying with it a coldness that seemed to reach straight into the bones. On the outskirts of the town stood an old, crumbling house. It was large, towering over the surrounding landscape like a dark monument, its windows like empty, watchful eyes. The townsfolk called it the Haverly House, after the family that once lived there, though few remembered the exact details of what happened to the Haverleys. Rumor and myth had transformed the story into a local legend, filled with half-truths and guesses. But everyone agreed on one thing: nobody who entered the Haverly house ever came out the same. Sarah Hartley had heard the stories. She'd grown up in Hollow Ridge, listening to the tales told by other kids, daring each other to go as close to the house as they could. She remembered the stories all too well, about how the Haverly family had disappeared without a trace. Some said they had been murdered, others said they'd been taken by something unnatural lurking in the forest. But most chilling of all were the whispered rumors that the house was alive, that it still watched over the town, and waited. It was the week before Halloween, and the air buzzed with an eerie energy. Sarah's friends had invited her out to the house, daring her to spend the night there, but she'd laughed it off. Sarah had grown out of such superstitions. She was practical, a realist. She knew the tales were just stories told to scare little kids. The Haverly house was nothing more than an old, abandoned home, a rotting structure filled with nothing but dust and shadows. There was no real danger, she assured herself. And yet, as she stood outside the house that night, staring up at its dark silhouette against the sky, an inexplicable chill crawled up her spine. Her friend Mark elbowed her playfully. "Come on, Sarah, don't tell me you're getting cold feet now." "I'm not," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. She didn't want her friends to see her nervous, especially not Mark, who loved teasing her about being too cautious. "Let's get this over with." The others cheered, their flashlights cutting through the mist as they approached the front porch. The old wooden steps creaked under their weight, as if the house was protesting their intrusion. A few windows had been shattered, and the door hung slightly off its hinges, a gaping mouth that seemed to invite them in. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped inside. The air inside the house was stale, thick with dust and a faint metallic scent. Shadows hung in every corner, shifting and slinking along the walls as they moved their flashlights around. It was as if the house itself was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in sync with their steps. "Let's head upstairs," Mark suggested, his voice louder than necessary. "Maybe we'll find something interesting." They climbed the narrow staircase, the wood groaning under their weight. It led them to a long hallway lined with doors. Sarah's stomach churned as they moved deeper into the house, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. She could almost hear whispers echoing through the halls, faint voices speaking words she couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, Amy, one of Sarah's friends, gasped. "Look! There's something written on the wall." They shone their flashlights over a section of the wall where faint, scrawling letters were etched into the peeling wallpaper. It was a single sentence, written over and over again in shaky, frantic handwriting. "Do not look. Do not listen. It is watching." What is that supposed to mean?" Amy asked, her voice trembling. Mark laughed nervously. "Probably just some prank from kids who came in here before us." Sarah wanted to believe him, but something in those words sent a chill racing down her spine. It felt like a warning, like someone had left it there for them, hoping they would heed it. They continued down the hallway, pushing open doors and peering into empty rooms. Most were filled with broken furniture and layers of dust, but one room caught Sarah's attention. It was a bedroom, the walls adorned with faded floral wallpaper. In the center of the room was a crib, untouched by time, as though someone had left it there only yesterday. "Creepy," Mark muttered, running his fingers along the crib's edge. "Why would they leave this here?" Sarah didn't respond. She felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward the crib. She reached out, her fingers brushing the worn wood, and in that instant, a vision flashed in her mind, images of a child's face, pale and frightened, and the feeling of something cold and dark creeping closer, suffocating. She pulled her hand back, her heart pounding. "Let's get out of here," she whispered, but her friends were already moving on, their curiosity outweighing any fear. They descended back to the main floor, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. It felt like the house was pressing in on them, tightening its grip, trapping them within its walls. Just as they reached the foyer, the front door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the silence. They all froze, staring at each other with wide, fearful eyes. What was that?" Amy stammered. Mark ran to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It's stuck." The panic in his voice was infectious. Sarah's heart raced as she watched him struggle with the door. She glanced around, her eyes catching movement in the shadows, a flicker of something shifting just beyond the edge of her vision. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, draped in darkness, its face obscured. Its presence radiated cold, and the air around it seemed to thicken, as though it were drawing the life out of the space. Who's there?" Sarah called, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, silent and still, watching them. Its eyes glinted with a malevolent intelligence, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. "Come on, we have to find another way out," Mark yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her away from the figure. They ran through the house, searching for another exit, but every door they tried was locked, every window sealed shut. The house was trapping them, twisting its hallways and rooms into a maze they couldn't escape. Panic set in, and Sarah could feel her mind beginning to unravel as the figure followed them, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. Finally, they stumbled into the basement, a dimly lit space filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. The air was damp and cold, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Sarah's breath hitched as she realized they were cornered. The figure appeared in the doorway, its form shifting and melting like smoke. It moved closer, and Sarah could finally make out its face, pale, hollow, with empty eyes that seemed to devour everything they looked at. "Please, let us go," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised a hand, and an unnatural darkness spread through the room, swallowing the light. Sarah felt an overwhelming cold seep into her bones, and she knew, deep down, that they would never leave this place. The last thing she saw was the figure's face, inches from her own, its empty eyes staring into her soul. And then everything went black. The next morning, the townsfolk found the Haverly House just as they had left it, silent and still. But if one listened closely, they could hear faint whispers echoing from within, the voices of those who had entered in the dead of night, forever lost in the shadows of the old house. To this day, the Haverly House stands, waiting for its next visitors, its doors open, inviting. And if you happen to pass by in the dark, you might just hear the whispers calling out to you, begging for release, or perhaps inviting you to join them, in the dead of night.